Okay, I think that we're ready. So with that, I'm going to hand it over first to our County Executive, Dr. Calvin Ball, to give some brief introductions and remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. And I want to first of all thank our Spending Affordability Advisory Committee team for your dedication to Howard County, your hard work over the last several months, and frankly, many of you over the last several years. It has been a challenging time, and it has been one that is wrought with a great deal of uncertainty, but your dedication, your vision, your steadfast support has been helpful for Howard County. I also want to thank our budget team, Dr. Holly Sun and Brooke Mamo, and everyone else who has worked incredibly hard to ensure that Howard County is in a strong financial position. And as we're still facing this pandemic, we still have the impacts that are being felt from the last couple years. And it is going to be a great job to ensure that we build upon what we've done thus far and move into the future. Howard County continues to be fiscally prudent with our budget, and our responsibility is reflected in receiving our AAA bond rating this year by all 3 rating agencies. Fewer than 50 of the approximately 3,000 counties have gotten that this year. In fact, just S&P in their finding noted that Howard County had very strong management, comprehensive policies and practices, and that means that when Howard County invests in the infrastructure that improve our quality of life, like our schools, our roads, our parks, and public safety, it is actually a minimal impact on taxpayers. And that's one of the reasons why our county employment growth is at 6.2%, which is about twice the state average. And just one the initiative that we did that I was particularly proud of was with our policy reserve, where just over the last few years, we were able to grow that from about 5 million to now over 30 million. We're going to continue to face critical decisions and move forward with our shared priorities as a community in this upcoming budget cycle. And we appreciate the thoughtfulness of the SAAC recommendations as we move forward with these budget choices in the coming months that are going to actually set the course of the next several years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, County Executive. And I'm going to hand it over to our Deputy Director of Budget, Brooke Mamo, to kind of kick off our presentation and introduce all of our SAAC committee members. Brooke?
Thank you, Sasha. Before I turn it over to Barbara, also on behalf of the Budget Office, I want to thank the committee members. In the last 2 months, it's been a lot of hard work. I think we had about a dozen meetings, most of them very early in the morning, some in the evening, some in the weekend, countless hours reviewing, documents submitted by educational entities and or county departments. So it's been a lot of work, and the end result is this report with a lot of recommendations that are going to guide us in developing our FY23 budget. So with that, I'll turn it over to Barbara and let her and the other members introduce themselves and give a little bit of a background of their background and their time with the committee.
Well, good morning.
Thank you.
It's nice to see everybody. Thank you, Brooke, and especially Dr. Ball. Thank you for impaneling this group and allowing us such freedom to ask so many questions and dig so deeply. I think this committee does a great job of that, and I think we give great guidance to the community, and to the council and to the administration. Excuse me. Swallowed something. But without further ado, let's get into the meeting. And could we have the media people introduce themselves so the committee has an opportunity to see who we're talking with? And I'm wondering, on my screen, I see Samir Sadi first. Could you?
Hey, Barbara, I'm Samir Sid. I'm the Chief of Staff to County Executive Ball.
Sorry, that's my
No
mistake.
worries. Yeah.
And I saw Mark Miller.
Mark is having some work done on his phone,
Yes,
so he might not be.
it is Mark
There he
Miller,
is.
and I am the Public Information Officer for the county.
Okay, and then we've got WBAL. Is that our only media partner here?
Yes.
Okay. Then could the committee each go through and introduce themselves? And I'll start with Josh.
Hey, I'm Josh Zucker. This is probably I think my 6th year on the committee, lifelong Howard County resident, and been involved on this and then also on the planning board. So this has been a great experience, and I enjoy doing it every year. It's a great overview of the county and the operations, and a lot of other dedicated Howard Countyans compile on this report. So thank you for appointing me, Dr. Ball. I appreciate it again.
Leonardo.
Thank you, Barbara, and good morning to everyone, and as well as to Dr. Ball. Leonardo McClarty, and resident of Elkridge, but here in my capacity as president of the Howard County Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you. Ellen?
Oh, did you say Ellen? Sorry.
Yep.
Ellen Flynn Giles. I'm an analyst in my real life. I've served on the school board. I've served on and still serve on a number of service nonprofits. And I think this is my 6th year, but I could be mistaken. It's certainly important work, and I've been happy to be able to contribute over time. Thank you, Dr. Ball.
Thank you, Ellen. Steve?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Hunt. This is also my 6th year. I had a couple of years off there, but glad to be back with the group. Thanks to Dr. Ball for the appointment. I really appreciate the opportunity, and also want to make sure to acknowledge our chair, Dr. Holly Sun, and our vice chair, Mr. C. Poignat, who showed great leadership in terms of this group. Wasn't quite herding cats, but there were some very vigorous conversations and discussions, and they managed things well and kept us moving. And the result of that is this report that is going out in this presentation today. I'm a Howard County resident for over 20 years. I'm also the vice chair of the Howard County Board of Appeals, and been involved in a lot of different capacities in the county. And again, always glad to help the county and be a part of moving this county forward. So this is just another great opportunity to do that, and very thankful. So looking forward to the conversation this morning.
Thank you, Steve. And I'm Barbara Lawson. I've been on the committee, I guess, for 7 years now. I'm a retiree, so I bring that perspective, but I've also been very involved in the nonprofit sector over my time in 46 years in Howard County. So I think I have a little bit of a point of view there. Just real quickly, before we take a deeper dive, I'd just like to say that I would say the theme of this year's report continues to be our wants versus our needs, but we've probably layered on to a greater extent the environment of uncertainties with inflation rising, interest rates rising, questions about new behaviors that are going to emerge out of COVID, whether people will be going back to offices, if two-member families are going to both be working. There's just so many questions. And now we've written a report, but since that report, we've even had a war happen, which throws another wrench in our thought processes and how we will see the world and our community going forward. So we would put those two together. We have to continue to balance our wants and our needs, and we need to look at the uncertainties and just keep an open eye and an open heart to what's going on around us. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Josh, who will start a deeper dive into our report. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Barbara. Sorry, I just lost my, I'll start, and I lost my little PowerPoint that had the report on it. So too many tabs open on my computer all at once. It's a hazard of, I guess, working from home constantly. I'm just gonna,
Josh, if I may interrupt for a second, does everyone see the document I put up on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
So I'm just gonna give a quick overview. we as a county are, it's from a little bit of historic perspective, our 2020 FY 2020 report or FY 2021 report was delivered to the county executive about a week before the state started shutting down for COVID. And so we walked into that year's briefing essentially saying, wow, everything is going to be off the table. All of the good work that we've done is going to be obviated by the shutting down of the economy for however long it's going to take to defeat this pandemic. And we expected fiscal calamity. Honestly, now 2 years later, that did not happen. Howard County was uniquely positioned both by good fiscal management, good fiscal stewardship in the years before COVID, but also because of the way our employment mix, our proximity to the federal government, and our own citizens' real estate and investment portfolios were all positioned during the pandemic. And the COVID economy ended up being incredibly, it was, whatever the opposite of a black swan is, I guess a white swan. The COVID economy was a white swan for Howard County. We benefited, uniquely, disproportionately benefited from $5 trillion of economic stimulus from the federal government. We have a large amount of federal contractors and federal workers here in Howard County. We also have a large mix of service sector and small businesses that were positively impacted by programs like the PPP. And then, our real estate market and our individual stock portfolios all took off during this pandemic as interest rates plummeted and more money was available for investments. So in the near term, we've had outsized growth that was completely unanticipated when the pandemic started. But we're coming out of that right now. We are entering an endemic phase of the virus. We're going to either be learning to live with it, or we have also catapulted ahead in many of the ways that we've been commuting, working, shopping, associating with neighbors and in the community, to a point where while we're healthy now, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know what the commercial real estate mix is going to look like as people return to the office or don't return to the office. And we still are hamstrung by the availability of land that is in Howard County for development. So there's those unknowns. And at the same time, we know that the Fed is going to start raising rates, which is going to make lending more expensive. It will also have a corollary of probably cooling the real estate market. As mortgage rates rise, there'll be less resale and less gains to real estate portfolios. And as we've seen in the last week, it's anybody's guess what happens to global energy prices when you have the largest exporter of oil and natural gas in the world being cut off from the world's economy. So there's a lot of headwinds, but at the same time, we have come out of this pandemic in a strong position. So that is why we are recommending, with the amount of headwinds on the horizon, some growth to the budget, some growth to bonding capacity, but modest. We want to make sure that at the same time, while we have this surplus, that it's spent on non-recurring costs, that is used to make our obligations that we have in infrastructure and other areas that can be one-time spending used for that, and then to also grow our fund balance so that we have a rainy day fund. Right now, we've done a good job of growing that rainy day fund, but it's still not to where we would like it to be, what is recommended for municipalities of our size to have. And that fund balance is what growing that rainy day fund is going to be imperative to if and when we face some headwinds in the future. While we are healthy now, and nothing has really changed from our pre-pandemic trajectory, from growing from a growing county to a maturing county. But while we enter this maturing phase, we do have this momentary, temporary bump in revenue.
Okay. Is it Steve is going to go next?
Believe so.
I think you may be muted.
I'm
Steve.
sorry, I'm muted. There are a couple more slides behind this that I believe. Okay, I have a different version. I'm sorry. Yes, I am next. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, there are more. I thought there were. These, I believe, are continuation, Josh, of you and Barb talking about revenue growth.
Okay.
Brooke, can you go back?
Is that where you want to be, Steve?
Can you go back?
Yeah, go back a couple.
Has Holly joined us?
Next one. Yeah, I just
Yeah,
joined.
you should be on this is where you should be.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Wonderful.
go to the next, because this one actually, sorry guys, I was a little bit late from a doctor's appointment on that. As George just mentioned that we have a lot of uncertainty near future. And the one example is even the revenue so far shows a spike, and counterintuitively our employment actually is still below the pandemic level, as you can see here. And also we lag a little bit behind the state, behind the national average. And next slide, a few slides, we'll look at the long-term trend. I know that Steve is going to take lead on that. So Brooke, can you go to next slide? Okay, Steve, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Holly. We talk about long-term growth, and really, the comments that we heard from Dr. Ball and also from Josh really tee a lot of that up in terms of long-term growth. So, if you think about it, there are really a couple of factors that will affect our long-term growth, and you'll see them right here. So we are maturing as a county. For many years, especially the 70s, the 80s, even into the early 90s, we were a growth county. We just were growing in terms of revenues, in terms of what we were doing in the way of development, new housing. A lot of that you'll see on the following slides that talk about Columbia and some of the other growth areas. So we are now starting to mature as a county. There's going to be less in the way of new development. It's going to be more about redevelopment. Our demographics are also changing. So those factors really contribute to what we see as the long-term growth. And really, if you look at that 2.3 number, which that really is actual revenue growth year over year in terms of our budget projections at 2.3%, that again really was the trend that we were looking at before the pandemic. And that again just calls out the fact that, as Josh mentioned and discussed, we really benefited from the pandemic in terms of, one, we were well positioned to withstand the economic impacts, but because of our demographics, because of our employment mix, not only did we not weather it, but we actually did very well. But that is not going to be the long-term trend. So that's something we want to emphasize here, that it's a one-timer. It is not what the trend will be going forward. So talk about a couple of things in terms of personal income and assessable property tax basin. Just so you all know, as a county, that our revenues are heavily driven by income tax and property tax. It is about, I believe, 90% of our revenues as a county. So as that goes, so goes the county. So if you look at in terms of development, this first slide talks about the trend lines over the past few decades. You'll see in the 70s, that's when Columbia was developing, the different villages were going up. So you can see really an explosion in terms of personal income, population, the whole 9 yards. Continued on into the decade of the 80s, started to slow down because Columbia was near completion. Some of the last villages were starting to be developed, et cetera. And then you have the 90s, and you can see the drop starts there and just continues on to the last decade. And one of the things that's not pointed out here from a development standpoint is somewhere in the mid 90s, I believe it was 94, 95, was our first APFO ordinance. And, that had a major impact as well. It continues to. And obviously, we're getting into some of the legislation, political things going on in the county with development. So that's a discussion for another day. But just want to point out that that's another, I believe, important date in terms of the slowdown in our growth. That obviously translates into the other chart here, the county property assessable base. You'll see the real drop. That is the Great Recession. So you'll see those years there. We have come back from the Great Recession, obviously, and we are in the positive. But as you can see, post-recession is nowhere near pre-recession. So that just tells the story of how that impacts our revenue growth. Next slide, please. So long-term demographic trends, and we're an aging county. That is just fact. If you look at these bars and the different demographics, they're talking about what the population growth is between 2000 and 2040. The heavy traffic is north of 55, and when you're talking about north of 55, you're talking about folks who are near retirement. In the case of a lot of people during the pandemic, some people decided to retire before traditional retirement age. So that trend is going to continue with, we're going to have a heavy population of people near retirement or retired. That impacts income. A lot of people who are retired, of course, are on fixed income. So that, again, directly impacts our income tax revenues, our overall revenues, et cetera, as opposed to the people that you would consider their prime earning years. So again, aging population just points us to being a maturing county, and that trend will continue. Next slide. Thank you. And the long-term development trend, you saw it on the first slide, just really with the slowdown of development. And there are a number of factors involved here. So that 7.2% number, that is land that can be developed in terms of brand new development. That's all that's left of the county. And this pie chart talks about it. And, the one thing I will say that, I've always applauded as a county is that, we are very much sensitive to the environment. So if you look at open space and parkland and preservation easement, you're looking at 39% of our land that will never be touched unless there's some pretty radical legislation that comes through. So 2/5 of our land is effectively untouchable. So the other 60% you can see, there's residential, there's commercial, and then there's that 7.2% that has not yet been developed. So as a maturing county, again, it's not going to be so much about new development, it's going to be about redevelopment. And you'll see how that's changed in the mix of type of housing, from 2001 to 2010, very heavy in SFD, which is single family detached. SFA is single family attached, your townhomes, condos, et cetera, and then apartments. So, very heavy in that single family detached, 42.6% there. The remainder of it is single family attached apartments. But you can see where we are in the past decade, very heavy on apartments. A lot of areas are being redeveloped, and it's now not single family, it's multifamily. Slight drop on the single family attached, but you can see the pretty precipitous drop on single family detached. So again, these are the trends that we face in the county, and it's important to talk about those because, again, because our county is so heavily dependent on income tax, property tax, that's going to translate into impact on our revenues long-term. Budget impact, of course, follows that. I believe that's my last slide, Holly. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Steve. All right, next slide. As a result of some of the factors Steve mentioned, demographic changes, shift in housing, housing type, development patterns, the revenue growth the county is seeing is just not keeping up with the spending needs that we have. In FY23 in the operating budget, the spending that's been requested from county agencies and our education entities exceeds our projected revenue growth by $121 million. This additional, just the additional request that came from a single entity, the school system, that alone is 129 million above what was the funding level in FY22. That's about 1.7 times our general fund revenue growth, or about 50 million above that amount. And by the way, just a quick note, this historic request is coming in at a time of declining student enrollment that we're seeing. We also have a similar situation as far as a gap between revenues and spending needs on the capital budget. The request for infrastructure spending from our county agencies and our educational entities between FY23 and FY28 exceeds our debt capacity by an average of about $20 to $25 million a year. All right. It's kind of a similar situation both in the operating and capital budget. Now, if we look at the long-term outlook for the operating budget, the structural gap I mentioned is not unique just for FY23. We did our most recent update of the multi-year projection, FY23 through 28, and that was developed with input from all our county agencies or educational entities, and that points to an annual gap or deficit that ranges between 121 million to about 280 million every single year. Closing this gap, as mandated by the county charter, because every year we need to have a balanced budget, is going to require some difficult decisions to be made. The next slide is going to address these challenges and some of the options we have available to address the challenges. I think Josh is going to go over this one.
I'm muted.
Sorry, I'm muted. God, it's like I've never been on these things for the last 2 years. Sorry about that. Right. So as laid out in this slide, there's really, the county has to balance its budget. And when the fiscal gaps appear, there are 3 ways we can balance our budget. We can raise taxes and fees, which nobody likes, but are sometimes necessary. We can control spending, which nobody likes, but is sometimes necessary. Or we can grow the tax base, which is the healthiest long-term solution to ensuring that we have the resources needed to face our fiscal challenges. As Brooke just went over, we are experiencing gaps between what's being requested and what the county can possibly fund. So, as the slide says, we are at kind of the limit, or we're of what we can do on income tax. That would need the state to actually, I believe, change the law on what we're available there. We can raise property taxes, but coming out of a pandemic, especially when we don't necessarily know what the long-term trend is for commercial real estate, that is probably not a good policy solution right now. And then we've done a lot of the other taxes and fees throughout the last, my time on the committee, where we've done an ambulance fee and transfer taxes. So we've basically hit all the low-hanging fruit we can on the taxes and fees. And then controlling spending, that's part of our solution here. And that's what we were saying. We want to increase the rainy day fund. That's one way to ensure that the money that we have coming in right now is actually saved rather than spent on ongoing expenses. And the county's also done a very good job of retiring a lot of the debt that was accumulated over the past few decades. But I can't stress enough that growing the tax base is the best long-term solution to this. And one of the recommendations that we have, the county is going through the general plan process right now. And we really strongly believe that the general plan process needs to take into account the fiscal situation of the county. There are redevelopment can go on. We might be near the end cycle of new greenfield development, but there are plenty of redevelopment opportunities across the county, and sometimes that might mean taking sprawling office parks and making them denser office parks, taking out some acreage of asphalt parking lots and replacing asphalt parking lots with dynamic, growing commercial and residential real estate. And as we said too, we need to grow our commercial tax base smarter coming out of the pandemic and understand and get ahead of the curve of where commercial real estate will be going coming out of the pandemic. I mean, maybe that is taking advantage of our geography and a work from home environment where people need more warehouse and other space. Maybe it's understanding that hopefully the trends are that some businesses want to relocate to places like Howard County because it's cheaper and offers more lifestyle amenities than Baltimore or Washington do. So tying our general plan to maximize economic growth is one of the best long-term solutions we can have.
I think I'm up next, Polly. So can I go to the next slide? Okay, this all builds on everything you've heard up till now. These are the recommendations that came out of the observations that have been made in the earlier slides. Back one. Back one. Brooke?
Back one.
This is
Back
what.
one.
There you go.
No,
Okay.
maybe
That's okay.
there's a little play.
That's all right. That's all right. So these are some of the key recommendations that are contained in the report. And the first one is to develop the FY23 budget based on less than the projected revenue in order to mitigate risk. As you've heard, this sort of artificial growth in our expected revenue is based on, again, extraordinary performance by the stock and real estate markets and the acknowledged huge impact of the federal stimulus. That is not continuing recurring revenues on which we can base a commitment to more recurring expenses. We need to look at ways in which to protect some of that money by putting it in, using it for reserves, or investing it in one-time projects that improve operational efficiency, training, in equipment, in things that will help us maintain and control spending as we go forward. The next one is to grow our reserves to 15%. As Dr. Ball mentioned earlier, we've managed to up the amount that we've put in the reserves, the policy reserve of 7 and the stabilization account last year put us at 7 and 3 or 10%. But in evaluating our peer counties, all of whom are at least at 15, and that's a standard used by S&P in assigning a AAA bond rating, we need to work towards that 15% peer level comparison to stay competitive and make sure that we can retain that that ranking, because it makes differences in more than just borrowing money. It sets the stage for how we're assessed as a responsible and prudent county. Again, limit use of one-time funding, including pandemic grants to non-recurring expense or debt reduction. We want to put that in places that can benefit us as we go forward, as opposed to committing us to additional annual expenses. And we do need to take the opportunity to look at reducing our debt and what the cost of that debt does to available funding in the operating budget. Back to focusing on needs versus wants. This is really a county-wide, community intense discussion to help us look at what's necessary to actually support our critical baseline needs across the county, across all demographics, and make sure that we're making prudent investments so that we can continue to deliver on those. And that leads again to balancing competing service needs. In a full service county like ours, we have to support our nonprofits who have been challenged during the pandemic to pick up the ball and help support on a service level to businesses and residents who have been severely impacted and are not experiencing the most rapid recovery, who are still in need, but critical to our continued economic viability. We must recover in order to even get to the levels we're predicting in future years. This next to last thing really is about limiting our above MOE funding to HCPSS. Last year, MOE funding for the school system was at about $620 million, with an additional $8 million added by the county council, and then $12.5 million in one-time funding, which did not impact MOE. That MOE of 628 actually served as the base for MOE for this year. This year, because we continue to reflect a pandemic or demographic reduction in enrollment at the school system, MOE is at 611.5 million. The request from the school system is at 757.4. That's an increase of $145.9 million, nearly 1.5 times what we were looking at, and nearly double the available money that we're anticipating for funding the entire operating budget in growth in FY23. And so if you look at this growth in spending across all educational entities, we have to recognize that this serves as our base and sets us up for increasingly costs at the recurring level. And we need to look at that carefully. We know how important education is in this county and to our future, but we really have to take a hard look at this and make sure we're looking at what we can maintain and sustain and still be able to deliver quality services. We can't spend 5 times what we're spending on public safety on one portion of the budget and be able to meet the needs of our demographics across the whole county. So I think I move on now.
Yes, I think Barbara is going to discuss the CIP.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm on, I believe. I think my work is actually fairly simple when I explain the 65 million recommendation and new debt authorization. If all the other panelists have said kind of the same thing, that we need to be in a balancing act right now of figuring out how much debt we can actually take on going into the future. Last year, we recommended 50 million, and so we have increased it slightly this year. And part of that's based on balancing the infrastructure maintenance backlog that we have and evaluating what the school system needs in terms of buildings and so forth. I would like to read 2 sentences from the report that stand out to me. And one is, the committee is pleased that the county has reduced its new general obligation bond budget for 4 years in a row, with authorizing the new debt set at a historical level of 72.5 million in fiscal year 2022. Now that is an amount above what we've recommended, but over the years, we've consistently seen that the county has really been disciplined in terms of bringing our debt obligation down. And so the committee would very much like to applaud those efforts by the county. I know it has been very difficult to make some of the hard choices, but we see that that process of balancing wants versus needs is in fact happening. The other piece that we pushed in our report is that as we take on new debt, and especially when it's buildings and so forth, that we really evaluate going forward. How much is it going to cost us in terms of staffing, operations, and maintenance of those new capital projects? It's important for us to get a handle on that because it does raise what our obligations are in the future. The other piece that we continue to be concerned about is the in terms of the debt burden, and I'm going to read this sentence to you too. Despite some improvement, debt burden measures continue to escalate in general. Specifically in fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, debt service payments as a percentage of total revenues exceeded the county policy ceiling of 10% and is projected to stay above 10% in the next several years. This exceeds what our bond agencies are happy with, but it also reflects their understanding that a part of that was pushed by the courthouse expenditures and kind of going through this hump. But if we maintain good discipline over the next few years, I think that we can manage our debt going forward. So yes, in fact, we are recommending $65 million in new debt authorization for this year and hope that the county can stay within those parameters. Thank you.
Barbara, are you going to discuss the last slide too, or?
Leonardo.
This is actually me.
Leonardo.
Yes, Leonardo.
And so I guess to close it out, the first thing I would say is, and in many respects, it's almost in some respects repeating or reiterating some of the things that have been touched on. But the biggest thing is that, we've got to long-term really take proactive strategies that will ultimately grow the tax base. And part of that is, looking at a multi-year fiscal plan that, will balance both the projected and requested resources. I think that we've heard consistently that we've got our revenues growing at 1%, but the requested resources, from various agencies are growing exponentially past that. And so we've got this conversation around wants versus needs will certainly have to continue, and particularly looking at it from the perspective, and I'm going to just kind of skip around just for a minute as we move down to this service delivery approach, as well as facility needs and so forth. And really just continually thinking about, again, this balance, in Howard County, certainly we have become accustomed at times over the years as to truly having, in many respects, high demands on a service delivery perspective. And I think we're going to have to ultimately think about, as an example, what are those things that maybe we continue to do as a county? Are there things and opportunities that present itself to perhaps partner or outsource, or are there things that maybe are being outsourced that we bring back in? I think certainly as we think about facilities, it's one thing for us to continue to add new facilities because of what it contributes to our way of life, but recognizing that with each new facility also comes increased staffing, increased operations on top of those facilities that we currently already have and must maintain as well. But also going back up now to the second bullet, the general plan. A lot has been touched on as it relates to what our development trends are. And certainly this general plan, which is going to guide and direct a lot of our land use decisions for the next several years, is extremely important. And particularly with recognizing that there's some that may feel like continued growth will maybe negatively impact perhaps our infrastructure, our schools, and so forth. But yet at the same time, we have to continue to grow that commercial base. And I think as many of us have seen over the years, there's a particular slide that the Economic Development Authority likes to generally share that talks about how many MedStar buildings, which many of you know was just completed about ballpark 3 or 4 years ago, how many MedStar buildings must be built just to grow the county's commercial tax base almost just a percentage point. And so recognizing that growing the commercial base is important, but it's also part of a long-term plan that truly won't take place just overnight. And I think the last thing is in terms of making the spending affordability a standing committee and continuing to enhance our public outreach. I think as evidenced here, there are going to have to be some very probably passionate and yet difficult conversations that are going to have to continue to be held within our community. I think when you look at, again, just take our education. Certainly, we know how Howard County, how we value our education system, our educational institutions. However, at the same time, we really have to balance, particularly some of those needs with other needs within the county, again, whether it be facilities wise, infrastructure, or what have you. And so I think that pretty much wraps up our presentation, when we'll certainly take any questions that any may have. But I think, just to sum it up, we continue to be at this fiscal crossroads in many respects, and that while things certainly look good on paper, we have to take into account some of those things which, again, may impact us in the future.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether the media friends have any questions there. We have until I think 10:30 to take the questions.
Our friends at WBAL have any questions, or was our presentation just that good? Well, let me just say thank you all again so much for your hard work and being willing to have those hard conversations to ensure that our county's fiscal house stays in order. I think that we are in a good place, but we have a lot of work to do, especially in these times of uncertainty. And your insight is immeasurably helpful in moving us forward. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Ball.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Yep.